It was 1970, and autumn brought a cold wind that cut through the streets of that small American town. For most, it was just another October night, but for 4 11-year-old friends, the night was about to become a matter of survival. Not against monsters, at least not yet, but against something much more tangible: the fists of Billy Marsh. The bully, with his crooked smile and grease-stained fists, cornered the group near the end of Elm Street. Mark Delgado immediately stepped to the front, his posture rigid, ready to fight even though he knew Billy was twice his size. But Tommy Sullivan, always the strategist, pulled his friend by the arm. He knew that wasn't a battle they could win with brute force. They ran. The sound of footsteps echoed on the damp asphalt as they sought refuge. Out of options, Tommy signaled toward the only place where even Billy wouldn't dare to step: the old house of the vanished scientist. The garden was dead, the windows looked like empty eyes watching the dark, and legend said that whoever entered there never returned the same. Hidden on the porch, holding their breath, they waited until Billy's shouts faded into the distance. It was in that heavy silence that Jeannie Kowalski saw something. It wasn't trash nor debris. It was perfectly geometric, clashing with the organic chaos of the dry leaves. Under the faint light of a distant streetlight, Jeannie wiped the dust from the surface. It was a board, but not an ordinary department store game. The surface was a matte gray, cut by black lines of surgical precision, and in the center, a white crack glowed with an intensity that seemed to have no light source, a pure white, without shadows. Lindy Harper stepped back, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She whispered that it felt wrong, that they should leave it where it was. But Jeannie's curiosity was greater than his fear. He recognized the symbols, the hexagonal grids. It was a battle map, an invitation. And Tommy, wanting to get everyone out of there and distract them from the fear they felt toward Billy, made the fatal decision: they would take the game to the basement. The Sullivans' basement was the group's sanctuary, walls covered in dark wood, the smell of cheap snacks and comic books, a safe place, or it used to be. When Jeannie placed the board on the center table, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow denser, more solid. As Mark chose his character, a barbarian of course, thirsty for action, something strange happened. Tommy's father's old radio, which was turned off on a shelf, emitted a sharp hiss of static. It was brief, less than a second, but it made Lindy drop her pencil. They ignored it. They were children hungry for adventure, and that board promised the most realistic campaign Jeannie had ever mastered. The pieces felt heavy, cold to the touch, as if they were made of bone and metal. Tommy took on his role as paladin, protector of the group, and gave the signal. The game began. The session was not normal. Jeannie narrated with a fluidity he had never possessed before, the descriptions springing from his mind as if he were seeing the fantasy world right there in front of him. But it was Mark who stole the show. He wasn't just rolling dice. He was living every strike. Sweat trickled down Mark's forehead. His eyes were glazed over, fixed on the board, his dilated pupils reflecting the pure white of the central rift. "I attack," he repeated, his voice hoarse, slamming the table with force. "I kill them all." There was no strategy, only fury. A fury that seemed to drain the energy from the room, making the single ceiling lamp flicker in sync with his moves. When they reached the dungeon's final boss, Mark stood up from his chair. He shouted a war cry and threw the 20-sided die with desperate violence. The die spun and landed on the number 20, a perfect critical hit. And at the exact moment the die stopped, the board emitted a low sound, like a deep sigh of satisfaction. The euphoria of victory lasted only seconds. Jeannie ended the narration, laughing nervously, wiping the sweat from his glasses. "It's over," Tommy said, feeling an inexplicable relief. They began to pack up their things, the adrenaline subsiding, the real world starting to make sense again. But Mark didn't move. He remained seated, staring at the empty board. Lindy touched his shoulder, calling his name softly. Without warning, Mark's body slumped to the side and collapsed onto the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud. Panic exploded. Tommy rushed to his friend, turning him onto his back, screaming for help. Mark seemed to be sleeping, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. His skin was cold, pale as wax. And then Tommy saw it, and horror chilled his blood. Beneath the closed eyelids, Mark's eyes were moving frantically from side to side. He wasn't unconscious. He was seeing something. He was still fighting. The silence of the basement was shattered not by monsters, but by the mechanical howl of a siren. The red lights of the ambulance spun outside, painting the wooden walls with intermittent flashes of blood and shadow, transforming the nerd sanctuary into a crime scene. The paramedics acted with brutal efficiency, pushing the children aside to reach the motionless body of Mark Delgado. Tommy Sullivan stood leaning against the wall, pale, holding the arm of a silently sobbing Lindy Harper. They watched, helpless, as their friend, the invincible barbarian who had just defeated a Dark Lord, was lifted onto a stretcher like a broken doll. There were no visible injuries, no blood, only that unnatural sleep and eyes that continued to dance frantically beneath closed lids, as if he were watching a nightmare at high speed. In the corner of the room, forgotten by the adults, Jeannie Kowalski trembled. But it wasn't just the cold. His eyes were fixed on the board upon the table. As the paramedics carried Mark away, Jeannie felt a sickening compulsion, a soundless voice in his head telling him that he couldn't leave that thing there. With trembling, sweaty hands, he shoved the board and the pieces into his backpack, feeling the object's weight anchor itself to his back like a tombstone. The City General Hospital was a labyrinth of waxed linoleum and fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect. The smell of antiseptic was strong enough to burn the nose, a chemical attempt to mask the odor of sickness and fear. In the emergency room hallway, time seemed to have frozen. The clock on the wall ticked rhythmically, each second hammering guilt into the consciences of the three friends sitting in the hard plastic chairs. Teresa Delgado's arrival shifted the atmosphere from tension to pure despair. She didn't run. She floated through the hallways like a ghost, her face drained of color. When she saw Tommy, she didn't scream. She simply gripped his shoulders with surprising strength, her eyes searching for answers the boy didn't have the courage to give. Teresa fell to her knees right there in the middle of the hallway, winding a dark beaded rosary between her fingers. Her prayer was a continuous, feverish whisper, a mixture of Spanish and Latin that echoed strangely in that temple of science. Lindy cringed, covering her ears, as if that mother's desperate faith were too painful to witness. The observation room door opened with a metallic click, revealing Dr. Eris Thorne. He adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses, consulting the clipboard with an expression of restrained irritation, as if the patient were being inconvenient by not presenting clear symptoms. He addressed Teresa with the coldness of someone who fixes machines, not people. The doctor explained in precise technical terms that there was no explanation. The CT scan was clean. There was no cranial trauma, no signs of drugs, nor viral infection. Mark's heart beat strongly, his lungs filling with air with athletic vigor. Physically, the boy was perfect, but he simply wasn't there. Dr. Thorne commented, with a tone of professional skepticism, that the only anomaly was the brain activity. The waves showed patterns of extreme stress, similar to someone running a marathon or fighting for their life, even with the body motionless. Jeannie, listening from the corner, felt a cold shiver run up his spine. He knew what that meant. Dr. Thorne saw a medical mystery. Jeannie saw the truth. Mark wasn't sleeping. He was still playing, and the game had no pause button. Dawn arrived, bringing a cold mist. Sent home by their worried parents, the group dispersed. Jeannie walked alone through the empty streets, the backpack weighing tons on his back. Every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence of the sleeping neighborhood. He avoided looking at the scientist's abandoned house as he passed it, but he could have sworn he felt static electricity in the air, as if the house knew what he was carrying. Upon entering his room, he locked the door. The usual sanctuary of science fiction posters and piles of comic books now felt strange, alien. He reluctantly pulled the board from his backpack, placing it on his desk. Under the pale moonlight streaming through the window, the matte gray surface seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. Jeannie sat on the bed, hugging his knees, staring at the object. Guilt was eating him alive. Fatigue overcame fear for a moment, and Jeannie dozed off while sitting up. He woke to a sharp thud, clack, the sound of something hard hitting wood. The room was plunged into deep shadows, except for one spot, the desk. The crack in the center of the board glowed with that pure and impossible white, cutting through the darkness like a silent laser. Paralyzed with terror, Jeannie watched. No hand touched the pieces. There was no wind, but the lead miniatures, cold and heavy, glided across the hexagonal grid with precise mechanical movements. They were not moving randomly. The monster pieces were rearranging themselves, surrounding the empty space where the barbarian miniature used to be. They formed a perfect circle of attack, an ambush. Jeannie held his breath, his heart pounding in his throat. The game hadn't ended when they left the basement. The game was playing itself, and by the formation of the pieces, it was winning. The air inside the room suddenly became unbreathable. That pale glow emanating from the central crack of the board was not just light, it felt like radiation, something toxic that made the hairs on Jeannie Kowalski's arms stand up in a primitive alert. He could no longer stay there. The dry sound of the lead pieces sliding on their own, that mechanical clack-clack readjusting the ambush against the invisible barbarian, was the final straw. Jeannie backed away until his back hit the door, fumbling for the doorknob with trembling hands. He had to get out, not just from the room, but from that house which now harbored a cursed object. Wearing only his pajamas and a hooded sweatshirt he grabbed from the floor, he unlocked the door and slipped into the dark hallway. The house was silent, the rhythmic sound of his mother's sewing machine having already ceased. Jeannie descended the stairs like a thief in his own residence, slipping out the back door into the cold night, desperately seeking to clear the image of the board from his mind. The street was dead. bathed in that sickly orange glow from the streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows at every corner. Genie walked hugging himself, the early morning cold biting at his exposed shins. He tried to rationalize the impossible. Perhaps it was magnetism. Perhaps he was hallucinating from sleep deprivation and stress. But the image of Mark Delgado motionless in that hospital bed kept returning like a punch to the gut. It was as he passed the entrance of a side alley where the local restaurant's bins awaited collection that he heard it. It wasn't a cat rummaging through trash. It was the sound of hard nails scratching metal. Genie stopped, frozen. In the deep darkness between two buildings, two white dots lit up. Eyes, but they didn't reflect light like an animal's. They emitted their own luminosity, cold and milky. The silhouette detached itself from the shadows, small, hunched, and reptilian, with an elongated snout that Genie would recognize in any monster manual. A kobold, the same type of creature they had slaughtered by the dozens in the campaign, now materialized in concrete and hatred. The creature hissed, a sound reminiscent of steam escaping a boiler, and lunged forward. Genie's survival instinct overrode his shock. He didn't think, he ran. His old sneakers hit the asphalt with a snapping echo that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the neighborhood. Behind him, the sound of claws scraping the ground approached far too quickly. The kobold was agile, a blur of darkness moving with the fluidity of spilled oil. Genie skidded around the corner of his street, nearly falling face first onto the ground. His heart was pounding so hard it hurt his ribs. He saw his house's porch as an oasis of light. He lunged up the steps, fumbling for the key in his coat pocket with fingers numb from panic. The sound of pursuit ceased abruptly as he entered the porch's radius of light. He dared to look back for a second. At the edge of the darkness, where the streetlight failed, the two white eyes watched him with intelligent malice before vanishing. He locked the door, turning the key twice and leaning his forehead against the cold wood, gasping for breath. The terror was now giving way to a hysterical certainty. He ran up the stairs and burst into the room again, unceremoniously flipping on the main light. The board on the table was still now, innocent, but Genie knew the truth. In the opposite bed, a figure under the covers grumbled and stirred. Daniel Kowalski sat up, blinking against the sudden brightness, his blonde hair messy and an expression of pure irritation on his athlete's face. He questioned, his voice hoarse with sleep and anger, what the hell his brother was doing at that hour and why he looked like he had seen a ghost. Genie couldn't formulate complete sentences. He just pointed to the window, to the board, to nothing, babbling about monsters and white eyes. Before Danny could explode into shouts, soft knocks on the door froze both brothers. Donna Kowalski's muffled voice asked if everything was all right. Instantly, the dynamics shifted. Danny, despite the confusion and irritation, took control. He replied with a forced calmness that it had just been one of Genie's nightmares and that they were already going back to sleep. They heard their mother's footsteps receding down the hallway. Silence returned to the room, but now it was charged with an electric tension. Danny climbed down from the bed, his physical presence filling the small space. He walked over to his younger brother, who was still trembling uncontrollably against the wall, and gripped his shoulders firmly. He demanded to know what was really happening, with no lies about games or fantasies. Genie spat out the words. He told him about the board moving on its own, about the connection to Mark's coma, and about the thing that chased him in the alley. A kobold, a low-level monster that was supposed to exist only on paper and dice. Danny listened to it all with an indecipherable expression, wavering between disbelief and genuine concern for his brother's sanity. The quarterback let go of his brother's shoulders and ran a hand over his face, exhausted. Danny declared, with the authority of someone who solves problems through brute force, that this would end tomorrow. He said he would go with Genie to this so-called alley. If there was something there, he would kill it. But if there was nothing, he looked into his brother's eyes with brutal seriousness. He would take Genie to see a doctor himself. Daylight did not bring the relief Genie Kowalski had hoped for. The sun was obscured by gray clouds, typical of that city which seemed to be forever in mourning, creating a diffuse luminosity without defined shadows. The meeting point was the same as always, the back of Mr. Harold's convenience store. The smell of old newspaper, tobacco, and cheap cleaning products usually calmed Genie's nerves, but today the air was heavy. There was a strange element in the group's equation, Daniel Kowalski. The quarterback took up too much space in that narrow aisle of comic books, his broad shoulders brushing against the dusty shelves. He looked at Tommy Sullivan and Lindy Harper not as his brother's friends, but as suspects in an inquiry. Danny crossed his arms, his varsity jacket creaking with the movement. He skipped the introductions and got straight to the point. He said that Genie had told him a story about what happened to Mark and about what they saw on the street. He made it clear in a voice that allowed no rebuttal that they were going there right now. The walk to the alley behind the local diner was silent. Mr. Harold watched the group leave through the front door, wiping his glasses with the hem of his dirty apron, his beady eyes narrowed in an indecipherable expression. Out on the street, Danny led the march. He rationalized out loud, almost as if he were trying to convince himself rather than the children. He spoke about stray dogs that turned violent with hunger, about shadows cast by car headlights, about collective hysteria caused by the stress of Mark's accident. Jeannie walked a step behind, feeling his stomach churn. He wanted his brother to be right. God, how he wanted it to be just a dog. But the image of the milky white eyes was burned into his retina. As they reached the entrance to the alley, reality seemed distorted. The place was mundane, overturned trash cans, puddles of stagnant water, graffiti-covered brick walls. But there were marks on the metal of the bins, deep, parallel gashes that no canine jaw could have made. Danny knelt to examine one of the marks, running his finger along the sharp edge of the torn metal. He frowned, muttering that it looked like it had been done with a tool, perhaps a crowbar. He was building his logical narrative, brick by brick, refusing to see the obvious. That was when the sound returned, the same scratching of nails on concrete. Lindy let out a muffled scream and pointed toward the back of the alley, where the daylight died into the shadows. From the shadows, the creature emerged, and it was at that moment that the world split in two. For Jeannie, Tommy, and Lindy, the horror was vivid, pulled straight from the pages of the monster manual. Its skin was scaly in a sickly rust tone, its snout elongated like that of a reptilian rat, and in its clawed hands, it held an improvised spear made of bone and twisted metal. It was a kobold, real, physical, and emanating an intelligent malice. It hissed, bearing needle-like teeth, but Danny didn't back down. On the contrary, he stepped forward, his posture aggressive like someone defending their territory. He shouted for the beast to get back. To Danny's skeptical eyes, there were no scales or spears. There was only a large stray dog, absurdly deformed by mange, its skin raw and foam dripping from its mouth. A sick animal, dangerous, yes, but natural. A biological aberration, not a magical one. The dissonance was dizzying. The group saw a soldier from a dimensional war. The quarterback saw a rabid dog. The creature lunged with a speed that defied biology. Danny acted on instinct. He tried to kick the animal, aiming for the exposed ribs of what he saw as a dog. It was a near-fatal mistake. The kobold, with the reflexes of a warrior, spun its body and lunged with its spear. Danny felt only a violent displacement of air near his thigh and a sharp pain where the tip of the invisible weapon tore through his jeans and the skin underneath. He stumbled, confused. How could a dog bite from that distance? Tommy did not hesitate. The boy grabbed a piece of rotting wood from the ground and threw himself between the monster and his friend's brother, brandishing it like a sword. The kobold recoiled, hissing at the defiant glint in the eyes of the children who saw its true form. They burst into Mr. Harold's store, nearly knocking over a pile of canned goods at the entrance. The old shop owner asked no questions. With surprising agility for his age, he rounded the counter, went to the front door, and turned the lock, flipping the sign to closed. He lowered the blinds, plunging the store into a safe dimness. Danny was leaning against an ice cream freezer, his breathing irregular, pressing his hand against the cut on his leg. He stared into space, trying to process it. He kept muttering that the dog was too fast, that something was wrong with its teeth. Jeannie and Tommy exchanged heavy glances. They knew they couldn't convince Danny with words. It was then that Mr. Harold's raspy voice cut through the silence. He was standing near the window, peering through a crack in the blinds toward the alley. Without turning around, he spoke softly, but with absolute clarity. He said that thing wasn't a dog. He had never seen a dog hold a spear. Jeannie's eyes widened. The old man turned to the children, his pale face illuminated only by the neon light of the beer sign. Harold saw it, and if he saw it, the nightmare was much bigger than they imagined. While chaos unfolded in the city's alleys, Patty Carpenter's world was silent, static, and made of paper. Her room, usually a sanctuary of order, now looked like the inside of a conspiracy theorist's mind. The walls were covered. Newspaper clippings about rabid animals, recent obituaries, and weather reports of sudden storms formed a disturbing mosaic. Patty sat in the middle of the floor with the posture of a meditating monk holding a spool of black sewing thread. She didn't see monsters, she saw data, and the data was screaming. She stretched a thread between a photo of the municipal park, where a dog was reported attacking trash cans, and the location where Mrs. Gable disappeared 3 days ago. The black line cut across the city map like a scar. She bit the cap of her pen, a nervous habit she tried to suppress. There was a pattern, a cruel geometry. The incidents weren't random. They radiated from a specific epicenter, spreading like ripples in a pond after a stone is thrown. And the strangest thing, the dates. Each peak of strange activity coincided perfectly with the weekends. Whatever was happening in this city, it followed a schedule. The police station smelled of burnt coffee and cynicism. Patty kept her chin up, clutching her notebook against her chest like a shield, while Sheriff Earl Hoffman didn't even look up from his paperwork. To him, she was just the girl from the school newspaper, a minor inconvenience in an already long day. She tried to explain. She spoke about the geographical correlation, about how the animal attacks were, in fact, cover-ups for something more systematic. She placed a photo on his desk, claw marks on a lamppost, too high for any bear or cougar in the region. Hoffman sighed, the sound of an old, tired bellows. He lit a cigarette, blowing a thick cloud of smoke that hovered between them, obscuring Patty's view. He told her to go home. He said the city was safe and that smart girls shouldn't make up horror stories to get attention. He wasn't listening. Or worse, he was choosing not to listen. Patty picked up the photo with fingers trembling from anger, not fear. If the law wouldn't see the truth, she would need irrefutable proof. Seeking a new perspective, Patty went to the general hospital, officially to deliver old newspapers to the waiting room, unofficially to verify her theory about patient zero. Room 304 was plunged into a silent gloom, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Teresa Delgado was there, sitting by the bedside, fraying the beads of a rosary with a hypnotic repetition. But it was the boy in the bed who caught Patty's attention. Mark Delgado was in a coma, motionless, hooked up to tubes. However, his body told a different story. He was drenched. The sheet was clinging to his skin from an excessive cold sweat. His leg muscles suffered microscopic spasms, tense as steel cables. Teresa stood up with a heavy sigh, picking up a damp towel to wipe her son's forehead. She murmured something about the fever that wouldn't break, about how he seemed to be running even while asleep. Patty felt a chill. It didn't look like illness. It looked like exhaustion, as if Mark's mind were waging a war somewhere the doctors couldn't reach. Footsteps in the hallway made Patty retreat into the shadow of the vending machine. She adjusted her glasses, watching through the reflection in the glass. It was them, the group of misfits who always seemed to be at the center of school trouble. But something was wrong. Jeannie Kowalski was walking fast, gesturing nervously, her face pale. Beside him, his older brother, the untouchable quarterback Daniel Kowalski, lacked his usual king-of-the-school posture. Danny was limping. There was a bulky makeshift bandage under the torn jeans on his thigh, stained with fresh blood. Patty's mind clicked. The attack in the alley earlier today, the unexplained injury, the urgent visit to the comatose boy who ran in his sleep. They weren't just witnesses, they were participants. Patty grabbed her camera, removing the lens cap with a fluid motion. They stopped at the door to Mark's room, exchanged heavy looks, and instead of entering, they turned around as if they had confirmed something terrible. As they headed for the emergency exit, Patty's mind was already made up. The sheriff didn't want to see the truth, but she would capture it, frame by frame. The night had brought a cold wind that cut through their thin clothes, but the group seemed not to notice. They stopped before the high wrought iron fence, now twisted and covered by years of dead ivy. The old scientist's house rose behind it like an architectural corpse, with broken windows that looked like empty eye sockets watching the deserted street. Jeannie Kowalski hesitated with her hand on the rusted gate, the tremor in her fingers visible under the yellow light of the street lamp. She looked back at her brother. Daniel Kowalski did not have his usual athletic grace that night. He was breathing heavily, his body weight shifted to his left leg, trying to relieve the pressure on his bandaged thigh beneath his jeans. With a short, stoic nod from Tommy Sullivan, they moved forward. The sound of metal screeching as they opened the gate rang out like a scream in the silent street. What they did not notice was the soft, mechanical click of a shutter coming from the shadow of a tree across the street. Someone was documenting every stumbling step of that intrusion. The interior of the house smelled of old paper and stagnant time. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating furniture covered in white sheets that looked like motionless ghosts. The floorboards groaned under Danny's heavy boots as he clenched his teeth with every step, breaking into a cold sweat from the pain he refused to admit. They were in the middle of the foyer when the world exploded in white light, a flash, blinding and sudden. Danny reacted by instinct, pivoting his wounded body and raising his fists, while Jeannie let out a sharp scream and dropped her flashlight. As the spots of light in their vision faded, a small figure emerged from the shadows of the staircase. Patty Carpenter stood there, her camera hanging around her neck like a smoking gun and her arms crossed. She did not look frightened. She looked furious. In a steady voice, she declared that she had known they were hiding something since the alley incident, and that trespassing would be just the icing on the cake for Sheriff Hoffman unless they started telling the truth. The tense silence was broken by Tommy, who placed his hand on Danny's chest to stop him from advancing. There was no hostility in Patty's eyes, only a hungry determination. She pulled out her notebook and opened it under the light of the fallen flashlight. They weren't childhood drawings, they were maps, charts, timetables. Jeannie stepped closer, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. He recognized the patterns immediately. Where Patty saw animal attack zones, Jeannie saw encounter zones for low-level monsters. The lines she had drawn on the city map coincided perfectly with the progression of the D&D campaign they had played in that very house. The revelation lowered their guards. They weren't enemies. They were different pieces of the same puzzle. Patty had the real-world data. The group had the game's context, and both pointed to the same place, the locked office at the end of the hallway, where the dust seemed not to dare to settle. The office door did not yield to brute force, but it yielded to intelligence. Jeannie found the hidden mechanism behind a false bookshelf, not by luck, but because the lock used a numerical combination based on mathematical constants he knew. When the wall rotated, the air that escaped from inside was cold and sterile. It wasn't an ordinary office, it was a laboratory. Old CRT monitors were stacked against the walls, connected by thick black cables that resembled necrotic veins. In the center, a brushed metal table displayed a single object illuminated by a beam of moonlight streaming through a skylight, an open geometric safe. Inside it rested a diary bound in gray synthetic leather. Patty raised her camera, capturing the surreal scene, while Jeannie moved forward as if stepping onto sacred ground. Jeannie opened the scientist's notes, and his eyes widened. The pages did not contain spells or incantations. They were filled with quantum physics calculations, vector diagrams, and theories about dimensional membrane superposition. The board was not a mystical toy. It was a mapping interface, a tool for opening doors. Beside him, Danny touched one of the pages. A chill ran down his spine. The diagram showed a creature dissected in geometric lines, the same one that had attacked him in the alley. For a second, the image on the paper seemed to pulse, gaining depth and three-dimensional horror. Danny pulled his hand back. His breath caught. He wasn't crazy. Science explained what his eyes refused to see. The discovery was interrupted by a sound that chilled everyone's blood. It didn't come from inside the lab, nor from the street. It came from the house's hallway, right behind the revolving wall they had left open. It was a heavy, wet, dragging sound, as if something large were pulling its own weight across the old wood. Tommy killed his flashlight immediately, signaling for the others to do the same. In the sudden darkness, the sound grew louder. Footsteps, too heavy to be human, and then a guttural breath, deep and hungry, echoed from the other side of the laboratory entrance. They were not alone in the empty house. The guttural breathing on the other side of the wall was not just a sound. It was a vibration that made the dust dance on the laboratory shelves. Daniel Kowalski did not wait for an order. Ignoring the sting of agony in his wounded thigh, he lunged against the false bookshelf that served as a door, slamming it shut at the exact moment something heavy collided against it from the outside. The ancient wood groaned under the impact. Black claws, resembling obsidian blades, pierced the panel inches from Danny's face, scattering splinters into the air. He shouted, bracing his boots against the concrete floor, turning his body into a living bolt. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the dust. He knew he could not hold that abomination for long. The brute force on the other side was inhuman, pushing him back inch by inch, scuffing the floor. As the door shuttered, Jeannie Kowalski leafed through the scientist's diary with trembling hands, her eyes scanning equations she barely understood. He shouted that they needed sound, something about destructive resonance mentioned in the footnotes. Lindy Harper, who until then had been paralyzed near the monitors, woke from her trance. Her eyes landed on a side workbench, a tangle of disassembled audio equipment, including a modified military radio transmitter and an acoustic amplification horn, a rudimentary megaphone. With an agility born of panic, Lindy rushed to the workbench. Her fingers, usually delicate with drawing pencils, now ripped out wires and connected plugs with violence. She understood the device's logic, a feedback loop. If she could create feedback and amplify it, it would be like driving a needle into someone's ear. Tommy Sullivan joined her, holding the heavy metal horn and aiming it at the door where Danny was about to give in. The bookshelf groaned one last time and partially gave way. A monstrous paw, covered in scales that seemed to absorb the light, forced its way into the laboratory, searching for flesh. Danny slipped, falling to his knees. It was at that instant that Lindy turned the volume dial to the maximum. It wasn't just a noise, it was a physical weapon. A high-pitched, distorted screech exploded from the megaphone, so intense that the glass of the old monitors vibrated. In the hallway, the creature let out a roar that wasn't of anger, but of pure pain. The monster's physical form seemed to flicker, like a television image losing its signal. The shadows that enveloped it unraveled under the invisible sound waves. Patty Carpenter didn't cover her ears. She raised her camera. The flash went off, capturing the exact moment the beast recoiled, writhing in dimensional agony, before fleeing into the darkness of the house. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the noise. They didn't wait to see if the creature would return. They ran into the cold night, jumping over the back wall and only stopping when the scientist's house was nothing more than a distant silhouette. In a safe alley, under the flickering light of a faulty lamppost, the group tried to catch their breath. The initial distrust had vanished, replaced by the camaraderie of those who had survived the impossible. Patty Carpenter was the first to speak. She opened her bag and spread the photos and maps across the dirty floor of the alley. Jeannie adjusted her glasses, illuminating the papers with the flashlight. Patty's data was irrefutable. Every location where someone had disappeared coincided with a zone of high electromagnetic interference. And with the locations of the missions the group had played on the board, they weren't just witnesses, they were the epicenter. Patty pointed to a disturbing pattern in the notes. People weren't being killed randomly, they were being taken, and the attacks always ceased temporarily after an abduction, as if a hunger had been satiated. She looked into Tommy's eyes and said what no one wanted to hear. Those creatures weren't hunting for sport, they were harvesting. A chill ran through the group. If the creatures were stockpiling energy, they were preparing for something bigger. And if Jeannie's theory about the game was correct, this energy had a destination. Danny wiped the blood from his hands onto his jeans and looked at his brother. The implication hung in the air. If Mark was fighting on the other side, he wasn't just facing monsters. He was facing an army that was being fed by the people of the town itself. Patty Carpenter's room was a sanctuary of organized chaos, a stark contrast to the filthy alleyway where they had sealed their alliance hours earlier. In the center of the rug, illuminated only by a flickering desk lamp, Jeannie Kowalski operated with the precision of a maniacal surgeon. Her hands, still stained with dust from the abandoned house, were dismantling the military radio transmitter that Patty had borrowed from her father. Leaning against the door, Danny Kowalski kept watch. His injured leg was stretched out, his torn jeans revealing a makeshift bandage stained with dried blood. Jeannie's theory, extracted from the mad scientist's notes, was terrifying in its simplicity. If the board was the door, the right radio frequency could be the doorbell. They didn't need to open the portal, they just needed someone on the other side to answer the intercom. While static filled Patty's room, the city's general hospital plunged into an antiseptic silence. Lindy Harper walked through the white corridors, her footsteps muffled by the linoleum floor. She had volunteered to stay close to Mark Delgado, serving as a physical anchor in case the radio experiment worked. The smell of ether and disinfectant made her nauseous. Upon reaching room 304, she found the door ajar. Inside, the gloom was cut only by the rhythmic lights of the vital monitors. Teresa Delgado sat in the armchair beside the bed, the beads of a rosary passing mechanically through her fingers. The woman seemed to have aged a decade in just a few days. When Lindy entered, Teresa looked up. There was a glint of suspicion in her eyes, a mother's intuition that those children knew more than they were saying. But exhaustion won out. With a weak nod, she allowed the girl to approach the bed where Mark lay motionless, trapped in a nightmare that no one else could see. Lindy pulled up a metal chair, the screech sounding like a gunshot in the silence of the room. She looked at Mark's face. He seemed to be merely sleeping, but there was a tension in his jaw, a constant cold sweat on his forehead, as if his body were running a marathon while paralyzed. She held his hand. It was cold, yet calloused. Feeling foolish and desperate, Lindy began to hum. It wasn't just any song, but the theme melody from the D&D campaign that Jeannie used to whistle before battles. Her voice trembled, low and raspy. Suddenly, the heart monitor's monotonous rhythm faltered. A rapid beep sliced through the air, then another. The green line on the oscilloscope, previously steady, gave a violent leap. Teresa jumped up, her rosary hitting the floor. Mark didn't move, but his heart was responding. He was listening. On the other side of town, at the exact second Mark's heart raced, the radio in Patty's room shrieked. The white static, which sounded like constant rain, was torn apart by a sharp interference. Jeannie almost knocked over the equipment, frantically adjusting the tuning dials. The bedroom lights flickered, the house's electricity reacting to the surge of dimensional energy. It wasn't a voice. There were no words, only broken noise. Patty was already prepared to shut everything down, fearing she would attract another monster, when Tommy Sullivan grabbed her wrist. He asked for absolute silence. Amidst the hissing, there was a pattern. Tap, 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 tap. Long and short pauses. Tommy turned pale. He recognized the rhythm immediately. It was the simplified Morse code he and Mark used to cheat on history exams. With trembling hands, Jeannie grabbed a pencil and began to jot down the dots and dashes in one of Patty's notebooks. The sound was repetitive, desperate, an infinite loop coming from the void. The group huddled around the paper, watching the letters form one by one. They expected a plea for help. They expected a "get me out of here." But when Jeannie finished translating, he dropped the pencil as if it burned his skin. Danny read it aloud, a horrified realization descending over the group like a leaden shroud. Mark's message was clear and contradicted everything they thought about rescuing him. The paper said only 4 words: "Don't let me win." The silence that followed the reading of the message was more deafening than the radio static. Danny Kowalski still held the paper where the words "Do not let me win" had been scribbled, staring at them as if they were written in an alien language. It was a contradiction. In any game, in any sport he knew, the ultimate goal was always victory. But Jeannie Kowalski, pale and trembling, began to babble a terrifying logic. He explained that if Mark Delgado was living the game as reality, the conclusion of the campaign meant the end of that universe. And if the game universe ended, the content, the monsters, the magic, the villain Vecna himself would have nowhere to go except out, to here. Before Tommy Sullivan could formulate a new plan, the military radio let out a violent spark. The smell of ozone and burnt plastic filled Patty Carpenter's room. The desk lamp exploded. And then, from outside, the world was bathed in rotating red and blue lights. They weren't monsters. It was the unmistakable sound of a police siren dying out in the driveway. Patty Carpenter reacted first, her survival instinct sharpened by years of social invisibility. She switched off the flashlight and pushed the boys toward the back window, which led out onto the porch roof. They heard Sheriff Earl Hoffman's deep, weary voice shouting at the front door, demanding to speak with Patty's parents about theft of government property and cult activities. The group didn't wait to hear their Miranda rights. They slid down the damp roof, landing clumsily in the tall grass of the neighboring yard. Tommy, taking charge, whispered that they needed to split up. If they were all caught together with the board and the notes, it would be the end. Danny grabbed his brother by the arm, promising to take him home through the back of the locksmith shop. Tommy looked at Patty. She knew the alleys better than anyone. Together, they ran in the opposite direction, serving as bait for the flashlights that were now sweeping across the garden. As the hunt began in the streets, General Hospital operated under a regime of tense silence. Lindy Harper was still in room 304, holding Mark's limp hand, when she saw the lights of a patrol car reflect in the window glass. Fear chilled her stomach. She knew she should have left hours ago. The bedroom door opened, but it wasn't the police. Nurse Joyce entered quickly, closing the blinds with a sharp snap. Without saying a direct word, she pointed to the supply closet at the end of the hallway. Lindy got the message. She slipped out, feeling small and criminal, while Joyce intercepted the police officers at the reception desk with her unshakable authority. In the side streets, Tommy Sullivan's breath burned in his lungs. He and Patty had managed to lose the patrol car by hiding behind a parked black Chevelle, watching the flashing lights cut through the darkness in alternating slices of white and shadow. When the police car pulled away, Tommy stood up, only to come face to face with a figure standing on the sidewalk. Father Michael Brennan was there, as motionless as a gargoyle in a cassock. He didn't seem surprised to see two children fleeing from the police at 3 a.m. With an unnerving calmness, the priest reached out his hand, not to hold them, but to offer something. He placed a small medallion of St. Michael the Archangel in the palm of Tommy's hand. His voice was a raspy whisper. "Evil does not respect badges, son. Keep the faith or keep yourself armed." Before they could ask what he knew, the priest vanished into the shadow of the parish, leaving Tommy with the cold metal against his skin. Sheriff Earl Hoffman's cruiser rounded the block, tires screeching on the asphalt. He was certain he had seen the Sullivan boy running into the alley. The old war veteran was tired of these games. He felt the city was on the brink of a collapse, and these children were at the epicenter. He braked sharply at the entrance of the alley, switching on the side spotlight to illuminate the trash cans. From their hiding place behind a rotting wooden crate, Tommy and Patty held their breath. The beam of light passed inches from their faces. The sheriff grunted, slammed his hand against the steering wheel, and shifted into reverse, frustrated. But as the cruiser backed away, Patty gripped Tommy's wrist tightly, her eyes wide with terror. Not because of the officer, but because of what was crouching on the roof of the car. A slender creature, with limbs far too long and skin that looked as if it were made of tar, was perched atop the siren, invisible to the man inside, but perfectly clear to the children. The sheriff thought he was the hunter, but he was merely driving the hearse. The bell above the convenience store door rang with an annoying cheerfulness, contrasting with the deplorable state of the children who swarmed into the establishment. Tommy Sullivan and Patty Carpenter entered first, bringing with them the cold scent of the mist and the fear of the alleys. Seconds later, the back door was flung open by Danny Kowalski, who was practically dragging his younger brother inside. Behind the counter, Mr. Harold asked no questions. The old veteran saw the pale faces, the dirt-stained clothes, and the trembling in Jeannie Kowalski's hands. With a grunt that mixed annoyance and protection, he walked to the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and lowered the metal shutter with a definitive bang. The world outside, with its hostile sheriffs and tar monsters, was temporarily blocked out. Inside, under the hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee, they were safe, at least for now. Without waiting to catch his breath, Genie swept a pile of newspapers and candy off the main counter, ignoring Mr. Harold's protests. He opened the city roadmap, crumpled and marked, and over it he unrolled the tracing paper where he had drawn the world of the D&D campaign. The boy's hands were shaking so much that Patty had to hold down the corners of the paper. Silence fell over the group like an anvil. You didn't have to be a genius to see it. Genie pointed to the areas glowing white on the game map, the zones that Mark Delgado had already liberated with his barbarian. They coincided perfectly, street by street, alley by alley, with the locations where Patty had marked creature sightings and disappearances. Where Mark won there, chaos flourished here. The city wasn't being invaded randomly, it was being terraformed. Genie's voice came out thin and broken when he finally verbalized the theory. He explained that there was no such thing as killing monsters in that shared universe. Matter could not be destroyed, only displaced. Every time the axe of Mark's barbarian severed a goblin's head or pierced a dragon in the game, that evil essence was expelled from the board and pushed into the only other reality available, ours. Danny looked sick, leaning against the shelf of canned goods. The logic was perverse. Mark thought he was being a hero. He was fighting with all his fury to cleanse his world, unaware that he was sweeping the dirt under the rug of his own home. The message, "Do not let me win," was not a plea to give up. It was a quarantine warning. Tommy Sullivan felt the cold metal of the St. Michael medallion pierce the palm of his hand. He shook his head, refusing to accept the obvious conclusion. He argued that they couldn't simply ask Mark to lose. Losing in the game meant physical death in the hospital. Patty, with the coldness of someone analyzing facts, completed the sentence that no one wanted to say. If Mark wins the campaign and defeats the final boss, the portal opens permanently. The game's universe collapses and everything that remains, including Vecna, comes here. The dilemma hung in the stale air of the shop. Saving their friend meant condemning the town. Saving the town required sacrificing their friend. Tommy looked at his friends, searching for another way out, but found only the somber and resigned gaze of Mr. Harold, who was cleaning his glasses with a dirty cloth, as if he had already seen this kind of impossible choice in distant trenches. The discussion was interrupted by a sound coming from the military radio that Genie had placed on the counter. It wasn't static. It was a rhythmic, heavy sound, like a giant's footsteps echoing in a stone corridor. Genie looked at the map again, her eyes wide with horror as she triangulated Mark's current position. Her finger traced the path to the location of the final battle in the game, the crypt of Vecna. When he moved his finger to the map of the city, he stopped. The blood drained from his face. Mark wasn't just near the end. From the sound on the radio and the location on the map, he had already passed through the gates. He was already inside the final dungeon. And if he was there, fighting Vecna's guardians, it meant that the barrier between the worlds at that specific point was already as thin as tissue paper. The sound emanating from the military radio was not just static. It was the noise of a distant storm compressed into a metal box. Genie Kowalski turned the dial with trembling fingers, cold sweat trickling down the back of her neck, while her eyes remained fixed on the point on the map where the real and imaginary worlds collided, the very shop where they were. The heavy rhythm they had heard before, giant footsteps on damp stone, was suddenly drowned out by something that sounded like metal tearing through metal. It was swords. It was screams. It was war. Beside him, Tommy Sullivan gripped the St. Michael medallion so tightly that his knuckles were white, the blood from his wounded palm staining the sacred metal. The air inside the convenience store seemed to have grown 10 degrees colder and heavier, as if the gravity of Vecna's crypt were leaking through the speakers. Mr. Harold stopped cleaning his glasses and moved his hand slowly and deliberately beneath the counter, where the matte glint of a shotgun barrel waited. Suddenly, the chaotic noise from the radio crystallized. A gasping breath, raspy and desperate, broke through the white noise barrier. It wasn't the voice of an invincible barbarian, it was the voice of a frightened child trying to be brave. Patty Carpenter held her breath as Mark Delgado's voice filled the silence of the shop, asking if anyone was there, begging for a sign that he wasn't fighting alone in the dark. Genie grabbed the radio microphone as if it were a buoy in the open sea. She shouted her friend's name, her voice cracking in a high-pitched register of panic. On the other side, Mark's reply came laced with delirious laughter and groans of pain. He described the darkness of the dungeon, the smell of sulfur and blood, and how close he was. He said he could see the throne. He said he was going to save them all. The horror of the situation hit the group with the force of a train, but the temporal and dimensional distortion transformed his words. Mark didn't hear the fear. He heard only distant voices, interpreting them as cheering, as encouragement. He announced he was ready for the final blow. He was going to kill the Dark King. Patty tried to grab the radio, her analytical mind searching for a phrase, a code that would break the boy's heroic trance. But she was interrupted. The sound of something colliding violently against the store's metal door made the entire building shudder. It wasn't the wind, it was claws. The illusion of security crumbled along with the front display window. The reinforced glass exploded inward, not into shards, but into dust, as if struck by a wave of sonic pressure. Liquid shadows, dense as tar and swift as mercury, poured into the store, defying the laws of physics. They had no defined shape, but Danny Kowalski, in his terror, saw in them teeth and claws, fragments of nightmares his brother had described at the gaming table. The fluorescent ceiling lights popped in sequence, plunging the sanctuary into a stroboscopic gloom. Tommy pulled Patty down just as a shelf of canned goods was hurled across the room by an invisible force. The radio, still on, broadcast Mark's battle cries, which now synchronized perfectly with the chaos in the store. Every blow he struck there reverberated here. The barrier was not just thin, it had been pierced. In the midst of the pandemonium, one figure remained motionless. Mr. Harold no longer looked like the grumpy shop owner. With economical and precise movements, he cocked the old hunting shotgun he kept under the counter. The dry click of the mechanism locking cut through the noise of the destruction. He looked at the children, dirty, terrified, cornered, and his eyes, behind the thick lenses, showed no fear, only a sad and hard resignation. He shouted an order that brooked no argument, pointing toward the back exit. He told Danny to grab his brother and the radio. When Tommy hesitated, trying to argue, the old veteran simply shoved him with surprising strength. He stated that he had seen enough wars to recognize an untenable position. Someone had to hold the line so the others could retreat, and this was his shop. Danny practically dragged Jeannie through the back door, with Patty and Tommy right behind. They stumbled into the cold, damp alley just as the first shotgun blast lit up the shop's interior with a violent white flash. The sound was deafening, followed immediately by the inhuman roar of the shadows fighting back. There were no cries of pain from Mr. Harold, only the rhythmic sound of reloading and firing, until a final crash silenced everything inside. In the alley, under the light rain, Jeannie looked at the radio in her hands. Mark's voice changed. The euphoria vanished, replaced by a cold whisper of belated realization. He said only 3 words, "He is here." And then, the radio died in a high-pitched hiss. Above them, the city's night sky was no longer black. Purplish clouds swirled in an unnatural vortex, and a silent thunder made the ground tremble, as if reality itself were cracking in half. The silence that followed the last shot from Mr. Harold's shotgun was more deafening than any explosion. In the damp alley, Jeannie Kowalski still stared at the dead military radio in her hands, as if she expected the static to bring the old shopkeeper back, or to disprove Mark Delgado's final 3 words. But the only answer came from above. Danny Kowalski was the first to look up, feeling the thin rain change temperature, becoming icy, unnatural. He pulled his brother by the shirt collar, forcing him to lift his head. What covered the city were not storm clouds. They were geometric shapes. The night sky had fractured into immense polygons of absolute black and leaden gray, spinning in a slow, nauseating vortex. And at the center of this silent cyclone, hovering like a cruel deity over the downtown rooftops, a colossal silhouette began to take form. Jeannie, trembling violently, recognized the shape, the tattered cloak, the missing arm, the aura of forbidden knowledge. It wasn't just a monster, it was the end of the campaign. It was Vecna. Patty Carpenter, with her journalistic instinct fighting against the panic, pointed to where the vortex seemed to touch the ground. The base of the shadow tornado was not random. It was anchored directly over the General Hospital. Tommy Sullivan felt his stomach drop. If Mark was there, and the entity was there, then the barrier no longer existed. He screamed for the group to run, his voice failing but his legs obeying automatically. As they ran through the deserted streets, the reality around them began to glitch. There was no other word to describe it. Streetlights flickered and transformed into floating gray blocks. The asphalt under their sneakers seemed to lose its texture, becoming smooth and artificial. It was as if the world were being rewritten, replaced by a digital and corrupted version of itself. Danny almost tripped when a trash can beside him disintegrated into black cubes that floated upward, defying gravity. The city was suffering a glitch. The rule of expulsion was no longer bringing monsters into reality. It was transforming reality into the game. Inside the General Hospital, medical logic had collapsed. Nurse Joyce ran through the corridors of the intensive care unit, trying to calm patients who were screaming as they watched shadows move across the walls. The emergency lights spun in an alarming red, but there was no fire. There was cold. A cold that penetrated the bones and made breath condense in the sterile air. The heart monitors no longer beeped in rhythm. They emitted static hisses. tuned to the same frequency as Jeannie's radio. In room 304, Teresa Delgado was on her knees beside her son's bed, her rosary clutched so tightly that the beads marked her skin. She prayed in a frantic whisper, a continuous litany against the deafening noise coming from outside. But what terrified her was not the building's tremors or the screams in the hallway. It was Mark. The boy's body on the bed was convulsing, but not in a human way. His back arched at impossible angles, and black veins, like spilled ink beneath the skin, pulsed from his neck to his face. The medical technology around him sparked and died, unable to process the energy emanating from that small, fragile body. The group reached the hospital entrance at the moment the structure seemed about to give way, but it did not yield under weight. It yielded under the presence. Above them, Vecna's manifestation was complete. A tower of geometric darkness with a single white eye, perfectly circular and emotionless, staring down. Tommy stopped, paralyzed. The St. Michael medallion in his hand burned like live coal, the blood boiling against the metal, but he did not let go. He placed himself between the entity and his friends, a tiny and defiant gesture against a god. The entity did not roar, it did not attack, it simply existed, with such intensity that the world around it had to make room. The hospital facade began to unravel into gigantic pixels, revealing the interior like a dollhouse cut in half. And there on the third floor, exposed to the apocalyptic night, was Mark's room. The liquid shadows that had destroyed Mr. Harold's shop now flowed into that room, not to attack, but to converge. They were returning to the source. Jeannie screamed her friend's name, her voice lost in the supernatural gale. In the exposed room, Mark's mother was pushed away by a wave of invisible pressure. The boy's body on the bed stopped convulsing. Silence fell over the city again, heavy and absolute. Slowly, mechanically, Mark Delgado sat up in bed. He turned his face toward the shattered window, looking directly at his friends below, and then at the colossal entity above him. When he opened his eyes, there was no iris, no pupil, none of the warm brown that Patty or Tommy knew. There was only a milky, glowing white, identical to the eye of Vecna. His lips moved, and his voice echoed not in the air, but directly in all of their minds, an overlap of his young voice with a guttural and ancient timbre. He smiled, a smile that did not belong on a child's face, and decreed the end of hope. The game is just beginning.